You are now listening to Coach Ham's Chronicles, the show that spills all types of leadership tea for the aspiring leader of colour.
Hey, what's going on? It is your girl, Coach Ham, with another episode of Coach Ham Chronicles. I want to thank Neville, as you heard him earlier, introduce the kid. So we are on episode 3, y'all, and I'm super excited because we're now talking about scapegoats and anecdotes. And this is when it comes down to true leadership development, and I really mean developing. So let's get started. Success is to be measured not so much by the position that one has actually achieved, but by the obstacles in which one has overcome in trying to succeed. Booker T. Washington. Now, these challenges might not be as sweet as they sound, and yet few have overcome them. But there's a huge gap that remains between the organization who are constantly saying versus doing, especially when it comes down to promotions of actual inclusion. And when I mean promotions, we're talking about diversity and inclusion. So let's start with the topic of the critical race theory. If you have not read the MSN article that was released about 3 weeks ago, long story short, it was about a overly ambitious, overly anxious Karen mom that was screaming at the top of her lungs during a PTA meeting that she did not want her child, somewhere in the Midwest, to be taught critical race theory in elementary school. And as she continues to go on and on about how this is just anti-American, she then finalizes her statement with, "I am not racist." I don't understand why I just did the Trump voice, but I did. Oh well. So if you don't understand exactly what critical race theory is, let me break it down to you. It starts with the premise that race is not only shaping individual psychological makeup, but it's also intrinsically part of their collective identity. And for the larger social structure, for leadership that starts to emerge, this is what's going to influence and experience who they are, how they act, how their thoughts process, and how they're going to lead. So at the same time, not only does this theory also become a positive for those who are in leadership, but also a little bit harder for those who may not necessarily understand what is needing for the next level of leaders. And when I do mean leaders, I'm talking about my aspiring leader of colors, my gurus, if you will, my great leaders rising up. Now, for the workplace who's ever dealt with the micro and macro power dynamics, here comes the systematic inequities that we have to deal with, that we always have to keep in mind to the forefront. It also reinforces that leaders have to recognize that their constraints are just what they are, constraints. They're not disabilities. They are not paralysis. It's just a constraint. And yet, while trying to find an opening to transcend said constraints, you're going to have to be able to shape your environment. And what comes down to that is literally going to be this critical theory that we as minorities, LGBTQA, LMNOP, as well as Latinx minorities have to deal with on a regular basis. So instead of undervaluing and squandering your Black talent, how about you do this, my private sector, Fortune 500 companies, U.S. government employees? Why don't you recognize that the resilience and robust sense of self that we as minorities have to constantly deal with is one of the most influential mindsets that you'll ever be in the presence of knowing. Now, realizing that studies have also shown that for African Americans and Latinas or Latinx, we're one of the most historically oppressed groups in the United States, and yet we are a melting pot. But yet, in order to bring us to the table, you're going to have to start questioning why you are doing diversity and inclusion. Is it because you want to check a box off of your annual quota, or are you actually trying to figure out, is it diversity of thought or is it diversity of skin that you really need? And remember, as we always said here at Paramount Intelligence, that we not only want to get a seat at the table, but we want to build a house around it. Shirley Chisholm also said, if they're not going to actually give you access to it, just bring a folding chair. So now that we're realizing that we as minorities need to be sitting at said table and not just taking notes, I want you to start thinking. Thinking about how can diversity really be transformative, not just for the business or your performance, but your effectiveness. You're going to have to be culturally driven. And for those who are emotionally intelligent, being able to understand the emotions and how you affect everyone else in the workplace is what's going to transcend you from always taking blame or using that victim mentality to start putting blame on those who don't necessarily look like you. The excuse can no longer be that because they wear natural hair that is not professional, nor that their attire is going to be beneath them. So here's a couple of numbers, because we always talk about stats on my show. The number of African Americans that have earned a bachelor's and or master's degree is about 12% of the U.S. workforce. 12%, that's it. And yet we're close to 13.4% of representation within general population. So let's do the math. I'm not really too good at math, but at least I know enough about this, that when you start thinking about your total gross and economic increase, 12% is what? Less than a fifth or a third of anyone. So that's 1 in 3 that have to sit at the table. So my question is always going to be around the CEOs. How do you encompass or empower those who are entry level? What do you tell that person that because they are different of thought and skin and tone, how do they get a seat at the table? How do you train them to start leveling up, if you will? And it's not that old school Super Mario games level up. I'm talking about how do you get them to a place that they're comfortable with being themselves and no longer having to feel the micro and macro aggressions that they constantly deal with day in and day out. At some point, you're going to have to realize that, look, diversity is a real thing. It's not a trend. We talked about that episode 2. But here are some of the anecdotes that I want you to be so focused on. That critical race theory is a real thing. If you stop doing the whitewash of old rhetoric and historic value that you claim is just American history and talk about the realness that came with slavery, 400 years of oppression, the Holocaust, the migration of the Japanese internment camps that were in California, every single melting pot and exterior that another organization or a group has dealt with, that's what's going to make us diverse. That's what's going to turn Fortune 500s into the next Amazons, Dells, Microsofts, you name it. That's just where we are. But in order to do that, you just need to start having diversity of thought. No longer using minorities and those who may not necessarily look or sound like you as the scapegoats. We'll start talking about episode 4 a little bit further into detail, but I wanted to kind of give you this and leave you with this. If you're going to start to level up, I need you to realize that here's the one thing that you're going to have to do. Find out where you can plug into, where you can help, where you can actually assist and ascertain those who are going to be transformative. Because what comes out of creativity is transformation. And out of that becomes increase in performance and effectiveness, which then also means retention. You're keeping people because they value not just the business, but they value you. And for all of my leaders and aspiring leaders of color, that is what you want. You want to be able to work yourself out of a job in the long run. So this has been episode 3 for Scapegoats and Anecdotes. I am your host, Coach Ham. Until next time, peace.
Diamonds in my teeth, I got a lot of shine. Running up the number, that's a lot of crime. If you try to take it from me, must be out your mind.